So what would you do for $1 million? Keep it PG, please. Now that I have your attention, let me ask that one more time. Those of you that might have been sleeping, you're awake now. What would you do for $1 million? Well, I want to tell you about 4 people who had the opportunity to win $1 million cash as long as they wouldn't let go. YouTuber and philanthropist Jimmy Donaldson, or Mr. Beast, as a lot of you all might know him, as our youth might know him on YouTube, is by that his username, posted a video December 2019 of 4 contestants having the opportunity to win $1 million cash by being the last person to leave their hand on the pile of money. Wow, right? Isn't that incredible? After a long and grueling, ready for this? 36 hours straight, there was a winner who had a nice payday right around Christmas time, so that came in handy, right? Now, just let's time out. Let's stop and think about this. I have lots of questions. 1, what if their arm cramped? Like, could they switch arms? 2, what if they had to go to the bathroom? Never mind, I'm not going to answer that question. But what do they do? And I'm always impressed at these kind of endurance competitions or these endurance challenges, whether it's a YouTube video or whether it's these endurance competitions on Big Brother and Survivor. Where are my reality TV people? Where are you at? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, right? Like we have to hang on to the thing and not let go for forever. And I'm always impressed with people who can do this because I couldn't last 3 minutes, let alone 3 hours, let alone 36 hours, right? And I think there's some things you have to have in order to have that kind of endurance. One is an athletic physique, and I shockingly don't have that, but that's beside the point. I would say another thing, one of the biggest reasons that these contestants, these people show the endurance that they have to stick it out through difficult situations is because they know the good that's going to come at the end of it. They know the good. They know that there is a prize coming at the end of their difficulty. And the same can kind of be true for you and I when it comes to our faith. Let me explain. Or when it comes to trials in our faith. Let me explain. See, we learned last message series, in our message series 167, when we walked through the book of James. We learned that James told us to consider it pure joy. Say pure joy. We learned that James told us to consider it pure joy whenever we have trials of any kind because of what it can do to our faith. Now, it doesn't mean to be happy in our misery, but James is encouraging us to recognize that God can even do something redeeming in the midst of our difficulties. And Peter actually says something else. Peter actually says something similar to what James said. And I want to invite us to read this together. This is 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 7. Ready, set, go. So be truly glad. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you must endure many trials for a little while. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. So Peter's telling us something similar to James. He's saying that through our trials, it has the ability to either ruin or refine our faith, much like fire refines gold. So what Peter's saying is that when the heat gets turned up on gold, it can actually come out being better than it was before. And the same can be true with our lives. When the heat gets turned up on difficulties, when the heat gets turned up on trials in our lives, we can come out being better. Our faith can come out being better than it was before. It can be refined. And I think one big difference in whether our faith is ruined by trials or refined by trials has to do with the title of our message series, and that's grit. We've been spending the past few weeks talking about grit and the idea of perseverance and strength and trust and direction in God through difficult circumstances. And we've been looking at some amazing stories of women in the Bible. And in the past couple of weeks, we've looked at stories of women and overcoming fear and overcoming drift, as we learned from Taylor last week about Deborah. And I want to invite us today to look at another story of another woman in the Bible, but this time how they overcame trials. And this woman that we're going to talk about today, we don't know too much about her. And here's what I mean. There's only a handful of verses that even talk about her, and we actually don't even know her name. We don't get her name in the story. And before we dive into the story, you need to know this comes from the book of 2 Kings in the Bible. Now, since I'm imagining some of you have forgotten, you might have memorized, you probably memorized 2 Kings a while ago, but you might have forgotten. It's okay, I did too. Let's have a quick recap of what happens during 2 Kings. Is that okay, right? I know some of you know, you can tell me, but we'll give a quick recap for all of us, So this is written over a 400-year span, both 1st and 2nd Kings, when you put them together, it's the book of Kings. This is written over a 400-year span, taking place right after the time that King David dies. And when King David dies, it talks about all the drama and all the kings that come through, and leads up to this moment where Israel is taken into captivity by Babylon. And the book of Kings, it also tells the story of two prophets that you might have heard of in the Old Testament, Elijah and Elisha. The book of 1st and 2nd Kings tells their story. So we're going to look at this, our specific story now, of a guy named Naaman. And Naaman, we're going to read, is a pretty good guy, except with one thing that he's got going on. And then we're going to read also the introduction of our unnamed, gritty hero. Sound good? So this is 2 Kings chapter 5. I'll read. You can follow along on the screen silently, or you can look at your message notes. They're in there too. It says, "Now Naaman was a commander of the army of the king of Aram," that was modern-day Syria. "He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, 'If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy.'" So let's recap here. Naaman is a commander of an army in Aram. He's well liked. He's a good guy. But he has one problem. He has leprosy. Now back then, leprosy, yes, it was just as debilitating physically as it was also to someone's identity. So let me explain. This was a physical toll and took a social toll on people as well. So not only was leprosy an incurable disease that would eventually result in death, but also there were Old Testament laws in place to have a negative impact on you socially if you had leprosy. You had to do things like wear torn clothes. You had to declare and cry out that you were unclean, whenever someone came near you so they could stay away and not get sick. You also had to live alone. So having leprosy was basically a death sentence, both physically and socially. And I often think about this when I read the story of Naaman. Naaman, the Lord had, he had a great victory, right? And Naaman was a victorious commander with a disease that, quite frankly, he himself couldn't find victory for. And while none of us are commanders in armies, we might have been, but while none of us are commanders in armies probably, we find ourselves in that same boat sometimes, don't we? Or we might have had great victory in our lives that we've had we think we have some control over, but then something happens to us that we, quite frankly, don't have the effort to get out of ourselves. So Naaman, it says, during his army's raids, they captured a young girl from Israel. Remember where she's from, Israel. That's important. So they captured a young girl from Israel and brought her back, and her job was to serve Naaman's wife. And so when she hears that Naaman is sick, she says to his wife, "If only my master would go and see the prophet in Samaria, that's who could heal him." And this is our gritty, unexpected, unnamed hero. And in these moments, she shows two really profound qualities. Two qualities that I think are essential to having grit: compassion and courage. Let's start with compassion. So notice how she starts. Notice when she speaks, the verses that we have where she's speaking. Notice how she starts that phrase. She said, "If only," say if only. "If only my master would see." So there's a desire here to see Naaman get well. Almost like a yearning. If only my master would see. Now don't walk too quickly past this. This unnamed servant girl has enough compassion in her life and in her to want to see the person responsible for her captivity healed. She is there. She was torn away from her family in Israel. She was torn away from her home. She is in enslavement because of Naaman. Yet she wants to see him healed. This is a bigger kind of forgiveness than just forgiving or having compassion for the person that cut you off on the way to church today. This is the kind of forgiveness and compassion that Jesus said as he hung on the cross and he looked out to the people and he said, Father, forgive them. This unnamed servant girl is a walking example of what it looks like to love our enemies. And when we think of compassion, we often don't think of it as something that would be associated with grit. See, grit, that's a tough word, right? You just say grit and you think like Dodge trucks, right? Like that's what I think of, I don't know. It's a tough word, right? Like outside, mud, grit. And compassion is a little softer, sweeter, right? And so what happens is sometimes we can get this twisted at what this servant girl was actually doing with her compassion. And let me explain what was not happening. This is not an example. The servant girl's compassion is not an example of her being a doormat and letting Naaman walk all over her. It's also not an example of her enjoying her enslavement. It's not that at all. In fact, some of you need to hear this today. This is so important. In fact, having compassion doesn't mean you have to be happy all the time. You can have compassion and still lament the dire circumstances that happen in life. But you can still have compassion for others at the same time. You can hold lament and compassion together. Both can be true, and both are signs of strength. No. This compassion that this servant girl had was born out of a fierce faith and godly grit. This was not a sign of weakness by her. This was a sign of strength. There's no greater sign of strength, I think, than loving the people that the world says we should not love or we should write off. That to me is a sign of strength. And we can speculate, right? We can speculate of what's not in the text. We could say, well, did this servant girl benefit from Naaman being alive? Or is there something we just don't know that's not written? Possibly. But here's what I do know from reading the text, from what we can see. This girl did not have a good life. And she had a lot of factors against her that would give, quite frankly, an easy excuse for her to not be compassionate toward the person who enslaved her and captured her. Yet she did just the opposite. She showed him compassion. And here's what I've discovered in life. Our compassion is birthed out of our brokenness and pain. That's where compassion comes from. Let me give you a couple examples of this. There was a study that was done recently looking at the patterns of giving to charity or charitable giving. And one overwhelming consensus from the study was that those in the lower income level gave a higher percentage of their available income to charity than those in the middle income level or the higher income level. And the conclusion of the study was not, well, people who earn more are more selfish. That was not it at all. The conclusion of the study was that people at the lower income level understand the gift and benefit of charity because they've been there. They know the relief that it can provide. So in turn, their pain, their tough experience is turned into compassion. I even see this in my own life, in my own story. As Taylor shared, I'm in my 7th year now of being a youth pastor here on staff. And I have a great compassion for teenagers. I believe that these next 3 weeks, the reason I get so excited about it is because I love seeing students take the next step in their faith. There's going to be a whole lot of students that take the next step in their faith and their relationship with God over these next 3 weeks of this event. And I believe now is the hardest time ever to be a teenager in the history of our world. Now is the hardest time to be a teenager for lots of reasons. And I think, when I think about it, my compassion for them was birthed out of the pain and brokenness I felt as a teenager. So I can remember when I was in middle school, my family went through a trauma. And that trauma left me wrestling still even today with lots of different things, sometimes intense anger and an inner critic and bullying myself and perfectionist and not feeling loved and a whole lot of other things. And I remember being in middle and high school and finding a youth group at this church that welcomed me. They invited me in. They put up with my junk. And they loved me for who I was. And life wasn't perfect, but I found good people and a good God at this church that made a huge difference in my life. And if I draw a straight line, I can tell you that my compassion for helping middle and high school students comes from the pain and sleepless nights and brokenness I felt as a middle and high school student myself. Friends, I want want you to stop and think, what is the greatest area of compassion in your life? What is the thing that just gets your soul fired up? And maybe, just maybe, you can draw a straight line back to a place of brokenness or pain in your life that you've experienced. And I want to encourage you to act on that, serve in that way, do something to ignite that compassion in you. But our servant girl, she didn't just show compassion, she also showed courage, immense courage. Look at the second part of what she said. She said, if only my master would see. And then she goes on, she says, the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. So this servant girl, she made a promise that, quite frankly, she wouldn't be the one to fulfill. She said, if Naaman would go and see this prophet, then this prophet and my God would heal him. That's a bold claim. That's a prophetic statement, isn't it? Because think about this the other way. What if that didn't work out? What if Naaman traveled all the way there, he wasn't healed? I think he's going to come back a little angry, don't you? And this story is not going to end the way that we want it to, especially for that servant girl. But this prophetic statement, this proclamation, what spurred that courage in her? Because as someone who's guilty of being quiet and too timid in crucial moments, I admire her courage. But where did it come from? It came from her faith. Remember where I said she was from? She was from Israel. And being from Israel, she had a heritage of faith. Her family probably raised her. She knew God. She knew of the prophet Elisha. She had a heritage of faith. And through her faith in God, she declared that Naaman could find healing. She pointed to the healer. And when I think of someone who demonstrates compassion and courage in a gritty way, I think of Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom was a Dutch watchmaker, and she helped many Jews escape Nazi Germany by allowing them to hide in different places in her home. And when asked, later on about her work as sort of the Nazi resistance, Corrie said that she felt like she was doing God's will the entire time, even in the face of direct opposition. She felt like she was doing God's will the entire time by helping the people escape, because she knew what was happening was wrong. But here's what's amazing about Corrie. During her time when she was free, and also even when she was enslaved, her work with Nazi resistance, she never credited her own effort. She always gave credit to God's strength in her. Here's one quote that she wrote of her saying this. Trying to do the Lord's work in your own strength is the most confusing, exhausting, and tedious of all work. But when you are filled with the Holy Spirit, then the ministry of Jesus just flows out of you. Friends, this gives me hope that even in my weakness, God can still use me. But it not only gives me hope, it also eliminates any excuse I have. See, because it's God that provides the strength and God that can provide courage and God that can provide compassion for me when I don't have it, I can't blame my boss, I can't blame my family, I can't blame my friends, I can't blame my Enneagram number for why I don't have it. We can choose to lean into God's strength because each one of us can be gritty people because God's the one that provides it. Now, at this point in the story, Naaman has a choice, doesn't he? He has a choice whether or not he can accept this invitation to go find healing or just sort of brush it off and not even give it any time. And after consulting with the king of Aram and after communicating with the king of Israel, Naaman decides to head out. He decides to go explore and investigate this healing for himself. But things don't go quite as he anticipated. Here's how the next part of the story goes. It says, so Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. But Naaman went away what? Angry, and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Parphar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went off in a rage. So check this out. Naaman, he brings money, gifts, and he wants a face-to-face meeting with Elisha. And guess what Elisha wants? None of that, right? Elisha sends out a messenger to talk to Naaman, basically giving him instructions of, hey, you'll be healed if you dip yourself in the Jordan 7 times. And then Naaman just gets angry. He says, no. This wasn't how this should have happened. Elisha should have come out to me, and he should have waved his hand over the spot and cured me of my leprosy. And why do I have to go to the Jordan? Can't I go to these other rivers? And Naaman, the best way I can picture this is having a 2-year-old toddler meltdown in the moment, right? Maybe it's because we're dealing with the 2-year-old toddler meltdowns in our house right now, but parents, you know this. Grandparents, you know this. When you look at your child and you tell them no over the simplest thing, the tears start welling up, and then the mouth opens, and then the explosion of crying happens, right? Yeah, we're living it now. Wait till they get older. Yeah, then I heard their vocabulary increases a little bit, which, anyways. But let's be honest, okay? Let's be honest. Inside all of us is a little bit of Naaman and a little bit of 2-year-old meltdown. When things don't go the way we thought they would, or when things don't go the way we want them to. We all do this. At least I do. I know I'm far too guilty of throwing away a dream, an opportunity, a relationship when something doesn't go the way I think it should. So I'm a recovering perfectionist, and so I have a lot of ideas how things should go in my head. And if things don't go the way I think they should, well then I'm out. It was a few years ago in my therapist's office where she helped me point out this unhealthy tendency in me. And she helped me develop this mantra. It's on the screen. It's let things happen as they do, not as they should. You know what grit is, friends? Grit is letting things happen as they do without trying to seize control and responding however we need to. You know what the opposite of grit is? Trying to control everything and then waving the white flag when things don't go our way. Grit is saying, I am going to respond how I need to respond. And Naaman, he had a choice, didn't he? And he almost walked away from the healing, right? He was ready to walk away from the miracle. The miracle was right there, and he was getting ready to abandon it all because things didn't go the way he wanted them to. Which has begged me to ask the question, how many times have I walked away 10 feet from a miracle because I just didn't like the trial I was in, or I didn't have enough grit to maybe trust God? And Naaman almost walked away. But as we see at the end of this story, there was another group of unnamed heroes that convinced him otherwise. It says Naaman's servants, once again his servants, went to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant. So there were 2 things that happened here. First is there's another unnamed group of servants that convinces Naaman otherwise. They convince him to not walk away 10 feet from the miracle, but to reconsider. And sure enough, their appeal worked. Naaman goes into the river and is healed, but there's another healing that happens. Did you catch it? Naaman just isn't healed physically. He's healed spiritually in that moment too. Because Naaman has this acknowledgement and he goes, now I know there's no other God except the God in Israel, Yahweh. See, Naaman had 2 healings that took place then. All because of the courage and compassion and grit shown by a young, unnamed servant girl. And her impact on Naaman's life, we can understand that impact in a different way too. It wasn't just for Naaman. There's something that we can learn from her story and her example too, and it's this, put simply in a sentence, is even when life isn't good, I can choose to declare God's goodness. That even when life isn't good, I can choose to declare God's goodness. Our unnamed servant girl, she didn't have a good life. She was enslaved, away from her family, held in captivity. Her life was not good. But you know what she did? She said, even though I'm enslaved right now, I'm going to tell you a God that can free you from your disease. She said, even though I'm away from my home, Naaman, you can go back to my homeland to find healing. She said, even though I'm not experiencing good in my life right now, Naaman, I'm going to point you to a God that is good and a God that will heal. That is grit. And we can show that same grit, friends. We can do this same thing. Of even if that diagnosis doesn't come back clean, we can say God is still a healer. Even if we're walking through pain and sorrow and grief, we can say God is still a redeemer. Even if we're between jobs and we don't have enough to provide for our family, we can still say God is a provider. Even if you're an addict and you relapse and you're struggling with addiction, you can still say God is a chain breaker because God is still good even when life isn't good. And all that means is pointing to the healer. Don't miss what this servant girl did. She didn't win her case in an argument like a lawyer for why her faith is better. She didn't prove to everyone that she was right. All she did was point to the God that can heal. All she did was say, I might not be experiencing goodness and wholeness, but I know a God who gives that. That's our call, friends. That's what we can do. That's how we declare God's goodness, as we point to the one that ultimately heals. And to do this practically, we want to give you a couple things, a couple ways to help you with this, of how do you declare God's goodness when life isn't good. Here's the first thing, is to remember God's goodness then. See, oftentimes, at least for me, I'm very quick to become hopeless when life isn't good right in the moment. And I tend to have a short-term memory where I forget all the things that God's done for me before. So if we become intentional to remember God's goodness then, what has God done for me before in my life? It can help us cling to hope now. Maybe that for you, that's having a folder where you have maybe cards and notes or some things in it to remind yourself of God's goodness. Maybe like what I do, maybe you need to do a gratitude journal. And each morning try to find 5 things you can thank God for where you've seen his goodness. We can remember God's goodness from then to sustain us now. But there's something else that we can do too. Not just remembering God's goodness then. The second thing is we need to celebrate God's goodness now. Even if we're not experiencing it in our own life, God is still good. And we can see evidence of his goodness around us. For me, honestly, it's just taking one walk around this church on a given day. Because I see recovery meetings happening where people are taking the next step in their faith and their sobriety. I see children here morning and night at a VBS at this altar saying yes to Jesus as their forever friend. I see students living out this firsthand faith for themselves through discipleship and serving. That's just in a given day at this church. I see our food pantry open, giving bags of food to people. God is still good. Even if we don't see it in our own life, he's still good and we can see it around us. This is the hope of Christ followers. This is why we can have hope when life isn't good, because God is still good. He has, as we just sang earlier, victory. And Jesus actually told us about this. John 16:33, he reminds his followers. He says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world, you will have trouble. But take heart, because I have overcome the world. What Jesus is saying is my name is victory. I have overcome the trouble you have in this world. That is the hope that we cling to today. This is why hope is alive. But we do have a choice in what we declare. I mentioned to you earlier, Corrie ten Boom. There's another story that she tells that for me is an example of this tough choice of declaring God's goodness when life isn't good. Corey tells the story of when she was preaching at a church, and after she was done, she went down and talked to some of the congregation members, and a man walked up to her. And she recognized this man from somewhere, and she put together that it was a former Nazi guard at the concentration camp where her and her sister were held. It was actually the same camp where her sister eventually died because of mistreatment from the guards. And the man came up to her and he talked about how great of a sermon it was, and Corey preached about forgiveness of sins and how thankful he was for God's forgiveness in his life. And Corey tells how she just looked at him and she tried her best to forgive this man, but her blood was just boiling. And she couldn't do it. She just saw anger for this guy, and that was it. And then she made this discovery, and she wrote in a memoir and in the book that she wrote about her own life. She said that she made this discovery that the world's healing doesn't rest on our own forgiveness or our own goodness, but that it's from God. And then she said this line. She wrote this line. She said, when God gives us the command to love our enemies, he not only gives us the command, but the love itself to do so. When she couldn't, God could. And friends, when you can't, God can. So will you have a choice? Will you declare hopelessness and brokenness of your circumstances? Or will you declare the hope and goodness found in God? Let's stand for prayer. God, we thank you for a hope that is alive today. We look to you now. We cling to this hope that's not found in our own strength or our own effort, but this goodness. God, we thank you for your presence as you walk with us through whatever trial we're walking through. God, we ask that you would be able to encourage us, to spur us to courage and compassion. Not from our own effort, but God, that we would look to you for that courage and compassion. God, we thank you for a grit for our lives that you provide to us. God, help carry us through trials when we can't walk ourselves. We thank you for hope today. It's in your name we pray. Amen.